I've always had a goal to hit 1,000 likes on a video, but you legends smashed past that and got one of my videos to over 2K likes. Let's break even more records on this video. Please smash that like button. And I want to try this one thing. I want to know who my devoted listeners are. So once you've done that, comment down below that you hit that like button hard, or even a kind message. Let's see who our loyal devoted viewers are. You know who you are. Once again, thank you guys so much. Now to these amazing stories.
I decided to get back out there and try something new after my last breakup. I figured speed dating would be a good way to meet some people without the long commitment of regular dating. My best friend had done it a few times, so I figured, why not give it a shot? She told me it was just a fun way to meet a bunch of people, and I was all for that. I wasn't expecting anything serious, just hoping to meet someone cool. Little did I know it would turn into a nightmare that I can't shake off. The event was at this quirky little bar downtown, the kind of place where the lights are dim and you can't really tell if it's an art gallery or a nightclub. People were buzzing with nervous energy. Some were chatting with friends, others scrolling on their phones like they were trying to avoid eye contact with the rest of us. As I walked in, I immediately regretted not wearing something that felt more speed date appropriate, but I didn't let it bother me too much. I wasn't there for a fashion show. I was there to meet some new faces. At least that's what I told myself. When I finally sat down at one of the tables, I was relieved to see that the guy sitting across from me seemed normal enough. His name was Greg, and he had a friendly smile. He started asking the usual questions about my job and what I did for fun. Honestly, it was easy to talk to him. I was starting to feel a little more relaxed, thinking this might actually be a good experience. But then things started to get weird, like really weird. He asked about my old college roommate, something I hadn't talked about in years. At first, I thought maybe we had mutual acquaintances, but as he kept going, it started to feel less like a coincidence and more like something was off. He asked if I still kept in touch with her, and it took everything in me not to look at him like he was crazy. How did he know about her? We hadn't even discussed college, let alone my old roommate. I tried to shake it off, thinking I was just being paranoid. Maybe I'd mentioned her on my social media at some point, and he remembered. But then it happened again. He asked about my hometown, specifically about the coffee shop I used to go to when I was in high school. I didn't even talk about that place anymore. It was a small detail, but one that I hadn't shared with anyone in ages. It wasn't something I brought up in conversation. The more he asked, the more I started feeling like I was losing my mind. Was this guy somehow involved in my past that I just couldn't place? It wasn't just those questions. It was the way he talked about my life, like he knew it better than I did. He mentioned specific moments I'd completely forgotten about, places I had visited, people I'd met, even conversations I'd had when I was younger. He knew things that no one would remember unless they had been there. It felt like he was reading from a script of my life, and the more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I became. Finally, I couldn't take any more. I asked him how he knew all of these things, how he remembered these details that no one else would. His response sent a chill down my spine. He just smiled and said, "I guess you've forgotten, but we've met before." I froze. What did that even mean? I couldn't place him. I thought I would have remembered if we'd met before, but the more I tried to think, the more I realized something strange. He had been at other events I'd attended over the years. I remembered seeing his face, though never in a way that stood out. He had always been on the edges of my life, lurking in the background, never really interacting with me, but always there. It wasn't like we'd had crossed paths by chance. He had been quietly following me, waiting for the right moment to make himself known. The truth hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't a coincidence. He had been watching me. I wasn't sure for how long, but it felt like my life had been under his radar for ages, and I had never noticed until now. The more I thought about it, the more it became clear. He had been slowly inserting himself into my life, piece by piece, waiting until I'd be alone enough for him to approach. The timer went off, signaling the end of our 5 minutes. I was so shaken up, I barely heard it. I was too focused on the fact that he had been there in the background for so long. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a weird coincidence. Maybe it was all in my head. But I couldn't stop thinking about how strange and unsettling it felt. When I stood up to leave the table, I was relieved to move on to the next guy. But Greg was watching me. His eyes followed me as I walked away, and the intensity of his stare made my skin crawl. I didn't want to look back, but part of me felt like I needed to make sure he wasn't following me. I told myself it was just nerves, but deep down I knew I was right to be scared. This wasn't just some random guy at a speed date. This was someone who had been keeping an eye on me for much longer than I realized. As the night went on, I tried to forget about it, telling myself I was being dramatic. But when the event ended, I felt a strange sense of relief to walk out into the fresh air. The night was quiet, the streets empty except for a few late-night walkers. But then my phone buzzed. I checked it, and to my horror, it was a message from Greg. It was simple. "I'll be seeing you soon." We still had a lot to catch up on. I didn't respond. I just blocked his number and turned my phone off. The next few days were a blur. I tried to go about my life, but it felt like Greg was always there, lurking just out of sight. Every time I checked social media, I wondered if he was watching me through the screen. Every time I went out, I felt like someone was following me. Eventually, I told a few friends about it. They thought I was overreacting, but I knew what I had felt. I knew that he had been in my life for a reason, whether I had known it or not. He wasn't just a random guy from a speed dating event. It's been a few weeks since then, and I haven't heard from Greg. But every time I hear footsteps behind me or feel someone's gaze on the back of my neck, I can't help but wonder if he's still out there quietly watching, waiting for the right moment to introduce himself again. I don't think I'll ever feel truly safe again, knowing that someone had been following me so close without me even realizing. I swung open the door of that old school diner with neon signs humming, expecting greasy fries and bad coffee, but not expecting a life lesson on stalking. The booths smelled like vinyl and nostalgia, and I slid into one by the window, sunlight filtering through checkered curtains. He was already there, nursing a black coffee like it was the elixir of life, looking like someone who'd just walked off a movie set. I smiled, trying to play it cool, then grabbed the laminated menu and pretended to actually read it. We started with the basics. What we did for work, he worked from home, which sounded dreamy. Favorite weekend spots. I was team hiking. He was more into flea markets. And which local band was overrated, we agreed the one at the summer festival was all hype. A waitress in a tight uniform brought our drinks. Mine iced tea. Is another black coffee with a side of swagger. He leaned back, swirling his cup, and said he had something interesting to show me later. I assumed it was a snapshot of his rescue pup or a vintage guitar he was proud of. I was wrong. A bowl of chili and cheddar fries arrived, and we dove in. The first few bites were everything I hoped. Spicy, cheesy, and the kind of messy you needed at least 3 napkins to survive. He watched me smear hot sauce on my fries and laughed, saying I wasn't afraid of a little heat. I liked that. I wiped my fingers and asked him what that interesting thing was. He paused mid-chew, fork suspended above his mouth, eyes glinting. He said he recorded parts of his past relationships to analyze female behavior and wondered if I'd like to see some clips. I choked on a fry. The waitress hovered nearby, waiting to refill our drinks, and I mumbled no thanks before she could notice. He shrugged, like offering up a recording studio tour. I tried to keep my tone light, joked that I was more of a live-action person. But he was serious. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, the screen filled with folders named by year and month, each one stuffed with video thumbnails. My heart started racing. Those thumbnails weren't of sunsets or concerts. They were awkward, frozen frames of arguments, tears, raised voices. I felt like I'd stumbled into a crime scene. He said he'd watch them later, frame by frame, to catalog things like voice pitch, eye movement, and argument triggers. He claimed it was purely academic, part of a personal project to understand communication styles. He even called it groundbreaking research. I nibbled on a celery stick from the chili bowl, trying to stay calm. I pictured myself in front of that camera against my will, a worst moments archived for some guy's thesis project. I wanted to ask how he'd get consent, but I didn't trust his answer. He shrugged again and said exes usually didn't mind once they saw his work's value. He might have been joking, but I couldn't tell. I took a sip of iced tea, the ice rattling like warning bells. He offered to show me one clip right then and said it was short and harmless. I forced a laugh and said I had to run upstairs to the bathroom. I slid out of the booth, heart pounding. In the dim hallway, I texted my friend for backup, only 5 minutes to stall. When I returned, he was scrolling through the clips, headphones dangling off one ear. I slid back in and forced a smile, trying to look nonchalant. I asked about his favorite band instead, hoping to change the subject. He played along for a moment, talking about obscure lyrics, then glanced at the phone and asked if I minded him watching a clip. I said yes, trying not to sound accusatory, but I don't think he heard me. He tapped play. My stomach lurched. The screen showed a dimly lit apartment living room. A woman, his ex, was yelling about something trivial, her voice wavering. He paused it, zoomed in on her eyes, pointed out how quickly her pupils dilated. He talked like he was teaching a class. Notice the micro-expression here, he said. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, a mix of fury and disgust. I stood up, nearly knocking the table. I said we should get the check. He frowned, like I'd ruined dinner theater. The waitress arrived, blinking at me, and I asked for the tab. He insisted on paying, but I waved him off and told him to keep the coffee. He watched me storm out, shoulders slumped, looking like someone who didn't know what he'd done wrong. Outside, the night air hit me like a wall. I texted my friend to meet me at the corner. My hands were shaking as I took out my phone and blocked his number. I tightened my jacket against the cool breeze and walked down the street, headlights passing, the diner's neon sign flickering behind me. I thought about privacy and trust and how easily some people cross the line. 2 blocks later, I paused by a bus stop, watching the passage of strangers. Everyone around me was just living, chatting on their phones, reading a book, waiting for a ride. No one was studying their tension or recording their arguments for research. I felt relief wash over me, knowing I'd dodged something ugly. I realized that vulnerability is a gift you shouldn't give to someone who turns it into data. I heard footsteps behind me and saw my friend jogging up. She threw an arm around my waist, asked what happened. I just shook my head and said it wasn't worth the story. We laughed about how insane it sounded, then caught a ride home. I stared out the window at empty sidewalks, street lamps buzzing, and that diner fading into the distance. Back in my apartment, I kicked off my shoes, flopped on the couch, and stared at the ceiling. I kept thinking about that phone full of clips and the poor woman who never asked to be his experiment. I vowed I'd never let anyone treat me like a case study. I decided to write about it later, not as revenge, but as a cautionary tale. I drifted to sleep with my phone in hand, set the alarm for sunrise yoga, feeling lighter. The nightmare of being someone's researched subject was over. As I closed my eyes, I felt grateful for boundaries, and for the simple fact that some dinners are worth walking away from before the bill even arrives. I walked into that tiny neighborhood cafe thinking I'd be grabbing a quick lot, and maybe swapping a few stories with someone new. The place was buzzing with early evening chatter and the smell of fresh pastries. I spotted him in the corner by the window, fiddling with his phone and looking like he'd been rehearsing how to start a conversation. He waved me over with a friendly grin, and for a moment I felt that tingle of excitement you get when you're about to dive into unknown territory. We dove into small talk, favorite movies, the worst songs on the radio, and that kind of stuff, until he paused, leaned back, and said he still lives with his ex-wife because of the dog. I blinked, spit out a sip of my chai latte, and tried to process this curveball. He shrugged like it was totally normal. He went on to explain that since they're technically divorced and the dog is more important than the logistics of separate beds, they continued sharing a bedroom. He even admitted he saw no reason to stop sleeping in the same bed. I felt my cheeks heating up. From where I was sitting, steamy cups and indie rock playing softly behind us, it felt like all eyes in the cafe were suddenly on us. My mind raced through all the possible responses. That's weird, isn't that awkward? Or maybe just cool story, bro. Instead, I asked him what breed the dog was, hoping to steer the conversation towards something less intimate. He launched into a passionate monologue about his ex's golden retriever, Bella, who apparently had separation anxiety worse than any toddler. He described Bella's morning routine of circling their bed like a ritual, whining if anyone dared to sleep alone. He said he and his ex-wife figured it was best to stick together for Bella's sake, and so far it had been working pretty well. I nodded, trying to look interested while feeling like the world had just reshaped itself. The sunlight through the window suddenly seemed too bright, and I realized my watch had stopped ticking. I wanted to ask how long this arrangement had been going on, but I didn't want to come off as judgmental. Instead, I complimented him on his loyalty to Bella, and he beamed like he'd just won a prize. As he talked about the dog's quirks, how she stole socks and snored louder than both of them combined, I tried to picture them all in the same bed. I imagined him half asleep, tangled in blankets, and ex-wife's arm draped over him like some twisted sign of peace treaty. My stomach churned. It felt like being a third wheel on a two-seater bike. He caught me staring at my locker like I was solving advanced calculus and joked that caffeine was the only thing he trusted more than Bella's instincts. I laughed, but came out shaky. My mind kept drifting back to the thought of sharing a bed with an ex. I'd always thought breakups meant cut ties. Apparently not in this guy's world. I decided to change the subject to dinner plans. He insisted on this tiny street taco stall he loved, promising the best fish tacos east of the river. We hopped on our bikes, me still trying to wrap my head around dog custody arrangements, and piddled down graffiti-lined alleys to a neon-lit trailer. The line was long, and the air smelled of lime and grilled corn. He held my bike steady while I unlocked it, chatting about the neighborhood's weekend bike races. When our tacos came, we perched on a low concrete ledge by the trailer, crunching shells soaked in chipotle sauce. He confessed he sometimes slept on the couch instead if Bella was having a rough night, but mostly he stuck with the bed. I focused on the sweet time of mango salsa, trying not to picture temper flares over blankets or the ex casually dropping by at odd hours. Between bites, he murmured that it was easier this way. No lawyers, no awkward furniture moves, just continuity for Bella, and maybe for themselves. He sounded almost philosophical. I found myself wondering how many boundaries you could blur before it stopped being a relationship and turned into a complicated roommate situation. I asked him if he ever thought of moving out and letting the ex stay. He shrugged again and said that would be selfish. Bella needed both of them for company. I wanted to call bullshit. Dogs adapt, people adapt, right? But he seemed so earnest, like he genuinely believed he was doing the kind, humane thing. We returned to the cafe, our bikes clacking against the racks. By then the place had dimmed its lights and more candles flickered on tables. I sipped water while he ordered a second latte, decaf this time, he claimed, so he could still fall asleep at a reasonable hour. I tried not to roll my eyes when he added that the best part of the night was coming home to Bella curled between them, tail tapping like applause. I debated whether to bring up the bedroom thing again or just let it ride, but my curiosity got the better of me. I asked if he and his ex-wife ever fought, the dog or anything else. He admitted they did, sometimes loudly, which is why filming bedroom wrestling matches made Bella freak out and cling to whoever sounded least angry. I paused. Filming? Wait, no, that's a different date. He laughed off my confusion and said, "You know me, always multitasking." I forced a laugh, but inside I felt like an outsider watching a couple navigate an ongoing relationship masquerading as a divorce. It was like being tossed into a weird backstage pass where I wasn't sure I wanted VIP access. At that point, I realized I'd been sitting for nearly 3 hours. My phone buzzed with a text from my roommate checking if I grabbed milk. I glanced at him, wondering how long this had become normal for him. The double life, the joint bed, the unresolved ex. He smiled at me and brushed a crumb off his lip. I could tell he expected some kind of reaction, maybe jealousy or outrage, or at least some attempt to stay his claim. Instead, I felt strangely tired. I told him I had to head out early, had an early work meeting in the morning. He nodded and walked me to the door, calling one last time to Bella before we parted ways. I waved goodbye, my brain flooded with images of the dog between them and questions about what boundaries even meant. I biked home under streetlights humming like lazy fireflies, chewing on that same question. At my building, I locked up and took a deep breath. The night air tasted like possibility and regret all at once. I wasn't sure if I'd text him again or if I needed a palate cleanser date to scrub away the weirdness. I climbed the stairs, unlocked my apartment door, and paused. No dogs, no exes, just my cat staring at me like nothing had happened. I collapsed on the couch, my mind replaying every awkward moment. And as I drifted towards sleep, I realized that sometimes what you learn on a first date isn't about the person across from you. It's about how do you feel when their world collides with yours. I pulled up to that trendy bistro thinking I'd stroll in, grab a table, and let the evening unfold at its own pace. The sidewalk lanterns glowed soft amber, and the sound of clinking glasses drifted out the door. I pushed inside and scanned the room, sizing up the mismatched chairs and the walls decked in local art. At a corner table draped in navy linen, Kara sat alone, her posture perfect, phone in hand. She looked up, flashed me a grin, and gestured me over like she'd been waiting just for me. I waved back, took a deep breath, and slid into the chair across from her. The hostess hovered with menus, but before the papers even touched the table, Kara waved her off. "We're good," she said, tossing her hair. My stomach sank. I glanced at the menu in my hands and then back at Kira, confused. She'd already ordered for the two of us, 2 glasses of Cabernet and the chef's special flatbread. I felt like I'd walked onto an exam without a study guide. The waitress hurried off, notebook ready, and I forced a smile. "Thanks, I guess," I said. Kira raised an eyebrow. "I wanted to test you," she explained, voice smooth. "I needed to see if you were an alpha." An alpha. The word hung in the air like a challenge. I flipped through the menu anyway, feeling its weight in my hands, like a shield I wasn't allowed to raise. Kara watched me the way a coach watches a rookie take the field. She leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes bright. "Most guys wouldn't question me," she said. "They'd just go with it." I tried to laugh it off, but the tension in my shoulders didn't budge. I cleared my throat and said maybe I just liked menus. She tilted her head and smiled like she knew I was about to fail. "That's not really the point," she said. Our first sips of wine arrived, deep red, legs clinging to the glass, and I tried to savor the flavor. I let the fruit notes settle on my tongue before replying. "I'm all for letting you pick," I said, "if you think the flatbread is the best." Her lips curved into something like relief. "Good answer," she said. My chest loosened a bit. We clinked glasses, and for a moment I tasted redemption instead of oak. The flatbread came piping hot, dotted with sun-dried tomatoes and dollops of ricotta. I took a bite, hoping that would mute the alpha talk, but Kira dove right back in. She explained that she did this with every date, ordered for them first, watched how they reacted. If they asked for a menu, they were out. She needed someone who followed her lead, someone confident enough to let her steer. I chewed slowly, knowing she was watching. Around us, couples laughed, servers hustled, and low jazz played in the background. I pictured myself as either a contestant in her personal experiment or as someone choosing to play along. I decided to test her back. I said I appreciated her taste, but asked if I could sample a heirloom tomato salad on page 3 next time. That word "next time" made her pause. I just slipped my own menu into the conversation. She cocked her head. "Next time," she repeated. I shrugged. "If you insist on testing me, maybe I get to test you too." I expected her to scoff, but instead she laughed. A clear, genuine sound that bounced off the ceiling. "All right," she said. "What's your test?" I took a sip of wine and said I like to choose our dessert. She studied me for a beat, then nodded. "Deal." After a few more bites of flatbread, we moved on to chicken piccata for her and lamb meatballs for me. The conversation drifted to travel, my dream to road trip the Pacific coast, her ambition to live abroad in Barcelona. I told her about a time I got lost in Big Sur, ended up chatting with strangers on a beach bonfire. She listened, leaned in, asked questions. The alpha test felt miles away. When the waiter returned with a flawless chocolate torte, I put on my best game face. I'd scoped the dessert menu in the restroom, memorized flavors and textures. I told him I wanted the salted caramel panna cotta instead. Kaya raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Bold choice," she said. I nodded and explained I was curious to see how it stacked against her favorite. She smiled, impressed, and for the first time that night, I felt on equal footing. Dessert arrived in a dainty crystal bowl, the panna cotta wobbly and pale against the glossy caramel pool. I dug in with a spoon, the silky custard teasing my taste buds. Kara tasted her chocolate torte and closed her eyes, savoring the bittersweet richness. When she opened them, she said she approved of my pick. "You passed," she said, still using that alpha language, but now with warmth instead of challenge. I leaned back, feeling the stress of the test melt away. We talked about music, my obsession with vinyl records, her love for live jazz sessions. We shared embarrassing concert moments and swapped playlists. I realized she wasn't just a demanding tester. She was someone passionate about curating experiences, and she wanted a partner who could keep up. By the end of the evening, we laughed until our sides ached. Kara reached across and tucked a lock of hair behind my ear. "I almost forgot to ask," she said softly, "what do you really think about menus?" I grinned and replied that they were kind of awesome. You could discover hidden gems, dream up new favorites, and own your choices. She nodded, eyes drifting to the empty plates and half-finished wine glasses. We paid the bill together, our tabs split evenly, menus tucked away in the server's hand, and stepped out into the cool night. The sidewalk lanterns flickered above us as we walked side by side. Kara slipped her hand into mine and said, "Next time you get to choose the whole menu." I squeezed her hand back, thinking about the future course of our dates. Under the streetlight glow, I felt a strange mix of relief and excitement. I'd walked into a pop quiz and come out with a story worth telling. Kyra looked over, smiled, and whispered, "You didn't fail." I laughed, and we turned down the quiet side street together, menus forgotten, but lessons and possibilities fully in hand. I stepped into that crowded beer garden expecting nothing more than cold drafts and the roar of people debating last night's game. String lights hummed overhead, and picnic tables were skirted with stickers from college campuses I'd barely recognized. I found him at the back, leaning against the railing, scrolling through his phone like he owned the place. He greeted me with a grin that felt halfway between charming and rehearsed, then waved me over to a table with a half-empty basket of fries. We kicked things off swapping bar stories, a roommate's disastrous attempt at homebrewing, his claim that this spot had the best wings in town. The wings arrived hot and battered, and I bit in, bracing for a flavor explosion. They were good, but nothing I'd write home about. He watched me chew and nodded approvingly. I figured we were in for a chill night of sports banter and friendly heckling. Then, between bites of honey mustard, he leaned closer and dropped the bomb. He votes based on how attractive he finds the candidate's spouses. Not their policies, not their speeches, but the person standing beside them. I choked mid-chew, nearly swallowing a chunk of wing. He shrugged like it was the most logical thing in the world and said it was the only honest way left. I wiped my mouth and asked him to explain. He said politics had become a beauty contest anyway, so why not be honest about it? He told me about the last election, how he skipped debates and fact sheets and just judged the spouses walking in with the candidates. If the spouse looked confident and put together, that candidate scored his vote. At first I laughed thinking it was a joke, but he was deadly serious, eyes fixed on me like he was daring me to argue. I felt a knot in my stomach as he continued, naming past races and his perfect scorecards. He described one candidate's wife as having that glow of integrity and another spouse as flat and forgettable, and how those impressions decided his ballot. I stared at my phone screen lighting up with notifications, but I couldn't look away. Around us, folks cheered a goal on the big screen, but his words echoed louder. He said politicians were actors, spouses were the real cameo, and he couldn't stomach someone hiding behind a partner who looked insecure. I thought about every time I judged a book by its cover, and realized I'd never felt so rawly self-conscious. I tried steering back to lighter territory, asking about the craft beer flight he'd ordered. He gave me tasting notes on bitter hops and citrus undertones, and circled back to his voting creed. He believed everyone was ashamed of superficial judgments, so he embraced them. Beauty, he said, tapping his glass, is the last honest measurement. The clink of ice in his drink punctuated the moment. My mind flashed to my grandmother's kitchen table, where she lectured me about civic duty and the weight of democracy. Here I was trying to digest honey mustard wings while facing someone who reduced it to a runway show. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the picnic tables, and I could feel the grin I'd worn fade into a frown. He stood up to grab us another round, leaving me alone with my thoughts and empty wing basket. I watched him squeeze through the crowd, imagining him deciding my worth by how I stood beside him, like I was his candidate. I felt hollowed out, like someone had peeled off the layers of what a date should be, layer by layer, until nothing but shallow metrics remained. When he came back, beers in hand, I toyed with the idea of calling it a night, but I let him settle in, hoping he'd see the absurdity and laugh it off. Instead, he popped the tab and said he was serious about honesty. He talked about transparency in politics and how spouses showcased a candidate's real lifestyle. He said dating was no different. He watched how someone presented themselves as a sign of authenticity. I stared at my glass and realized I'd spent half the night sharing real stories while he reduced me to an accessory. I thought about the smell of fresh grass, laughter from kids chasing soccer balls nearby, the mellow hum of strangers unlocking their phones. It all felt like a backdrop to his self-made experiment. I nodded when he asked if I agreed. He tilted his head, waiting. I took a breath, wiping beer foam from my lip, and told him I valued substance over style. He raised an eyebrow like I dared to critique his thesis. He asked what I meant, so I spoke about character, kindness, the way someone treated the waiter, the respect in their voice when talking about family. He blinked, paused, then laughed, a short, surprised laugh that didn't reach his eyes. He said he admired passion, even if he didn't share it. He suggested a second date to visit a polling station together to see firsthand how I'd vote when not judging spouses. The idea of walking through a civic building beside him, worrying he'd tally points against me, made me feel queasy. I stood up and told him thanks to the wings and the honesty, then slipped my phone into my pocket. His face fell like I'd unplugged his experiment halfway through. I stepped away from the table where half the fries were untouched and the benches were sticky with spilled beer, and I walked toward the garden exit. Outside, the night air smelled of cut grass and distant fireworks from a block party. I took a deep breath and felt relief wash over me. No more spreadsheets of attractiveness scores in my future. No more silent beauty contests deciding my worth. I realized sometimes the most honest way is simply to walk away, trusting your gut over someone's twisted logic. I headed down the path lined with fairy lights strung between trees, each step echoing my own heartbeat. Behind me, laughter and cheers faded into the night. I didn't look back. I kept walking until the beer garden's glow disappeared, leaving me with a quiet realization that some votes, especially the vote for yourself, can't be swayed by a pretty face. I've been looking forward to hitting that little sushi spot all week, so when I finally pushed through its paper lantern-lit entrance, I felt a rush of relief. The place was cozy, tucked between a boba shop and a bookstore, with warm wood panels and the calming hiss of the kitchen behind the counter. Walking in, I spotted Mia already settled at a corner table, her phone glowing in the dim light. She glanced up, heaving a confident grin, and I slid into the seat across from her, ready for a laid-back night of spicy tuna rolls and casual conversation. Almost immediately, however, she put down her phone, leaned across the table, and said, "Before we order, I need to know you'll give me all your passwords within 24 hours. My chopsticks paused midair as I stared at her. In that instant, I felt the floor drop out from under me. Passwords, like mail, social media, phone lock. I blinked and tried to smile, hoping she was joking. But her eyes were serious, and she was already sliding a printed sheet over to me titled Trust Foundations. The bullet points spelled out every account she wanted access to: Instagram, Snapchat, Venmo, banking apps, and more, and a strict deadline. Should I laugh? Should I run? Taking a slow sip of water, I desperately scanned the sheet. Meanwhile, the waitress hovered at our table with menus poised for action. Mia waved her off without a second glance. "We're past menus," she said. "We're in trust territory." Feeling like a cat forced underwater, I set the menus aside and said, "That's a lot for a first date." She shifted in her seat and explained that she believed complete transparency was key to avoiding the usual dating games. "If you've got nothing to hide, it shouldn't matter," she said, her tone bordering on militant. As the waitress retreated, menu still in hand, I tried to gather my thoughts. My mind raced through every horror story I'd ever heard about hacked bank accounts and stolen identities. Even as I reached for my chopsticks again, my appetite vanished. I offered an alternative. How about a shared photo album? "I'll let you see everything I post, and we can screen share if you ever want to check in." She cocked an eyebrow and tapped her pen against the table. "That's halfway," she said. "But halfway isn't good enough." Shaking my head, I said I valued my privacy and believed trust had to be earned gradually. She sighed, the kind of exasperated exhale you give when someone refuses to accept your terms. When she pressed on about past betrayals, how she'd caught an ex flirting in secret group chats, and another hiding online banking statements, I realized she wasn't just paranoid, she was scared. I felt a flicker of sympathy, even as my gut told me this was way too intense for date number one. By the time a small platter of edamame arrived, I was mentally exhausted. The bright green pods were the only hint of normalcy in this surreal precision test. I shelled a pod, chewed slowly, and asked if she'd relaxed her demands for at least the sushi itself. She smiled wryly and said the edamame example was proof. I'd shared my appetizer without complaint, so maybe we could build from there. Her gaze was laser-focused, like she was scoring a parenting exam rather than enjoying dinner. While Mia unpacked her arguments about government leaks, data breaches, and oppressive privacy settings, I found myself missing the carefree first date banter of favorite movies and travel stories. Instead, we were knee-deep in auditing each other's digital shadows. When the sushi chef set down our rolls, spicy tuna unagi, a rainbow of nigiri, I barely noticed. My chopsticks trembled as I picked up a piece, and the heat from the wasabi hat made me wince. I wondered if I'd wince again at the thought of handing over my phone's passcode. Once we'd eaten enough to justify a second round of orders, I steeled myself. Okay, I said, exhaling hard. I'll give you access to my social media accounts, Instagram, Twitter, that sort of thing. But I'm not handing over my banking info or my phone's main lock code. Let's start building trust, not give each other the skeleton key to our lives. A tense silence followed as she studied my face. Finally, she nodded. Fine. But we moved fast on the rest. That promise felt both thrilling and terrifying. Our second round brought a shared order of miso ramen and a side of shrimp tempura. With a steaming bowl between us, conversation shifted slightly. I told her about my weekend hike up to that waterfall trail, how liberating it felt to disconnect. She listened, nodded, and then countered with a story of her digital detox retreat, where she insisted all participants swap phones and log out for 48 hours. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here we were, negotiating passwords over bowls of broth. As the noodles softened and the steam curled into the air, I realized that beneath all the password talk, there was a genuine desire for connection. She wasn't trying to control me. She was trying to shield herself from being hurt again. I said as much, telling her I understood needing to protect your heart, but also that real relationships needed space to grow without force. She paused mid-slurp, soup dripping from her chopsticks, and gave me a look that felt like approval. When the shrimp tempura arrived, crisp and golden, Mia put down her chopsticks and said, "Let's make a deal." My heart pounded as she laid out new terms. I'd give her social media access now, and in exchange she'd let me decide on our next date's location. I grinned, relieved at the break in tension, and agreed. We toasted with miso broth and tiny porcelain cups of sake, the first genuine smile between us since our passwords impasse. Dessert came in the form of green tea ice cream drizzled with black sesame syrup. I scooped up a bite and offered it to her, feeling strangely victorious. She tasted it, smiled, and said she approved of both my dessert choice and my boundary-setting skills. We laughed about how ridiculous the night had been. On any other date, shouting about Venmo access would have been a deal-breaker. But somehow we met in the awkward mill. Walking out into the cool night air, I felt a rush of exhilaration. The city lights flickered overhead as we stepped onto the sidewalk, and I realized we were no longer just two strangers at a sushi bar. We were two people who'd navigated a minefield of digital demands and emerged curious, even hopeful. Mia slipped her arm through mine and said, "Text me when you've set up that shared album." I pulled out my phone, unlocked it, and handed it to her. She smiled as she tapped in her login, just Instagram and Twitter for now. As we turned down the street toward the subway station, I realized that building trust can be messy and intense. But sometimes you have to dive in headfirst, share a bit of yourself, and see if the other person swims alongside you. I waved goodbye at the station entrance, already thinking about what I'd wear on our next date, maybe someplace without so many tests. The night's password negotiations had been wild, but I wouldn't trade that memorable first date for anything. I had been dragging myself through a long week of dead-end meetings and broken promises, so when Kirkland suggested we meet at that laid-back coffee roastery, I was ready for a mellow catch-up. The place was tucked between a vintage record store and a vegan bakery, with exposed brick walls and rowdy espresso machines hissing in the background. I spotted him by the window, shoulders relaxed against a leather couch, scrolling on his phone. He looked up, flashed a crooked grin, and waved me over. Once I settled in, balancing my iced Americano and a blueberry muffin, he leaned forward and dropped his bombshell. "I don't believe in therapy," he said, arms spreading out on the couch. My heart did this weird little skip. Was that even a conversation starter? Before I could ask why, he continued, "But I love dating women who go to therapy because they already know they're the problem." I stared at him, half expecting a punchline, half bracing for fireworks. The barista called out a name for a steaming latte, and I shook myself out of my shock. I laughed, but it came out more like a nervous cough. He didn't seem apologetic. Instead, he took a slow sip of water from his reusable bottle and asked if I agreed. I glanced around at other customers lost in laptops and serious hushed conversations. Therapy was a big deal for a lot of people. I wondered if he was testing me or just casually spewing nonsense. I cleared my throat and said I believed therapy could help some folks, myself included, and asked if he had any strong feelings about it. He shrugged, looking me dead in the eye. It's a racket, he said. People pay to talk about themselves when they could just admit they're the problem and fix it. I took a bite of my muffin, feeling suddenly like crumbs in his theory. I told him that sometimes issues run deeper than just admitting anything, and that a trained therapist offers perspectives friends can't. He raised an eyebrow like I casually declared the moon was made of cheese. Then he cracked a smile and said he admired my open-mindedness, but really wanted a partner who didn't need a shrink's approval. My stomach churned as he explained he saw therapy as a sign someone couldn't handle real life. I wondered if I'd misread his profile of expecting a guy who liked hiking and documentaries, but got a walking tweet thread on self-help fraud. Around us, the coffee shop buzzed with chatter. Two friends planning a road trip, a student furiously typing an essay, a solo reader flipping pages in a dog-eared novel. I counted to 3, took a deep breath, and switched tactics. I said I respected people who work on themselves, with or without a therapist, and asked if he ever considered he might have blind spots. He paused, eyes narrowing, then laughed and asked which of my issues I wanted to dissect first. I shook my head and asked him instead if he'd ever been to therapy. He relaxed back into the couch and admitted he went once, years ago, after a tough breakup. He said the therapist told him to own his mistakes, but he walked out feeling worse about himself. He said he decided right then that self-reflection was fine, but paying someone to listen made no sense. I nodded and asked what he did instead. He smiled and said he wrote in a journal, read self-help books, got advice from friends. The afternoon light shifted through the big windows, casting golden lines across our table. I stirred my coffee and decided to find common ground. I asked if he thought naming problems was useful even without a professional guide. He agreed that self-awareness was key, but insisted the guidance of a good therapist would only reinforce negativity. I countered that a therapist could also teach coping strategies, help reframe thoughts, and prevent friends from burning out by being unpaid counselors. He rubbed his chin and said maybe I was looking too deep into it. He flipped his phone around to show me a list of podcasts he loved about stoicism and personal growth. He said he learned plenty through free audio lessons. I admitted I binge listened to podcasts too, but therapy felt more intimate, like having a conversation tailored just for me. He nodded as though humoring a quirky preference, then changed the subject to his weekend plans. I let the topic drift, relieved to escape the therapy debate. We talked about his new rock climbing hobby, how he scaled that indoor wall, and the rush of touching the top holes. I spilled about my disastrous attempt at a pottery class that ended in a lopsided bowl. He laughed, and for a moment I almost forgot his earlier comment. He had that easy charm, bright eyes, and a laugh that sounded genuine. Then, just as I started to relax, he circled back. "So you really think therapy is worth the money?" He asked casually, stirring his latte. I looked at my half-finished drink, then at his curious face. I told him therapy was an investment in mental health, like going to the dentist to keep your teeth healthy. He gave me that interesting look and said maybe he needed a dental cleaning too. We both laughed, the tension easing. By the time the sun dipped low, we covered everything from favorite movies to dream travel spots. He admitted he wasn't completely against therapy, just wanted to keep his options open for cheaper alternatives. I confessed I'd never laughed so hard over a jar of pottery clay or debated therapy in a coffee shop. When the barista announced last call, I realized we'd spent nearly 3 hours there. We stood up, mugs in hand, and I felt something unexpected, a mix of relief and curiosity. Despite his stance, I liked his honesty and the way he challenged me. He walked me to the door, paused, and asked if I'd ever considered journaling instead of therapy. I smiled and said I'd keep that in mind. He chuckled and said maybe I'd convert him yet. I stepped out into the cool evening breeze, the coffee shop's neon sign humming behind me. I glanced back at Kirkland's silhouette in the window, half-confident smirk, half-thoughtful frown. Somewhere between his dismissal of therapy and his rock-climbing tales, I realized I'd actually enjoyed the date. I waved once, turned down the street, and let my thoughts wander. Maybe neither of us had all the answers, but debating life's big questions over coffee felt worthwhile. And who knows, maybe next time he'd order a journal and pen for us both. I thought I was in for a casual brunch at that cute little cafe on the corner. Sunlight through the windows, the smell of fresh pastries, easy conversation over avocado toast. When I walked in, I spotted Samantha waving me over to a wicker chair at a glass-top table, her latte already half empty. I slid into the seat across from her, expecting a few minutes of chatter before the food arrived. I had no idea I was about to start on her future family planning session. The first sign something was off came when she set a clipboard on the table and flipped it open like it held the secret to the universe. Instead of a work outline or a menu cheat sheet, there it was, rows and columns of baby names. Some were traditional, Emma, James, others quirky, Zephyr, Indigo. She passed the clipboard over, asked me to circle my top 3 picks just in case this works out. My fork hovered over a perfectly poached egg as I blinked at the page. I hadn't even ordered yet, and she was drafting a list for future offspring. While I tried to process this unexpected turn, a basket of assorted muffins and ceramic dishes of fruit landed between us. The server backed away quickly, eyes darting to Samantha's clipboard as if she'd interrupted something private. Samantha waved her off, took a bite of blueberry muffin, and gestured for me to pick names. I glanced down at the list, heart pounding. I hadn't been on a date in months, and this felt like being handed a quiz before I'd had a chance to introduce myself properly. I cleared my throat and ran through my mental favorites. Emma felt friendly but common. Luna sounded cool but maybe overdone. I landed on Clara, Milo, and Nora, circling them with a flourish. Samantha nodded approvingly, jotting notes next to each. Meanwhile, I tried to sip my iced tea without spilling it, staring at her like she was a magician pulling rabbits out of a hat. Babies weren't even on my radar. Heck, my weekend plans were usually Netflix binges and taking my cat to the clinic for her annual checkup. She set the clipboard aside and launched into her backstory. How she'd always loved names, how she dreamed of starting a family since she was a teenager, how she didn't want to waste time on endless dates if things clicked. I admired her clarity of purpose but felt like I'd been drafted into a co-writing session for her memoir. I asked about her favorite cafe dishes and she nodded, but her eyes flicked back to the clipboard. It was like she put down a crackling fire only to stir it again the second I blinked. Our plates arrived, crispy hash browns, eggs Benedict piled high, and a side of salthead spinach for good measure. I dug in, trying to shift my focus to flavors. Tangy hollandaise, the smooth runny yolk, the pop of fresh pepper. Every bite felt intense, like I was eating under a microscope. Samantha balanced a tablet on her lap, where she pulled up even more name lists grouped by origin and meaning. She pointed to a column of Irish names and asked if I liked Saurus or Shine better. I mouthed the names silently, not wanting to mispronounce them, and she smiled when I got it right. By the time the second round of coffee arrived, I felt like I'd been through a whirlwind mixer of name generators. I asked about her own background with names, if she had a sibling with a dated name or a parent who regretted their choice, and she shared stories about her grandma's unpronounceable Polish name and her uncle Samuel's love for short, strong names. I realized she was serious. This wasn't a quirky icebreaker, it was a deal-breaker gauge. If I balked now, the date might end before dessert. When the server came around with banana bread drizzled in caramel, Samantha asked if I'd circle backup options, just 5 more in case our first picks didn't pan out. I nearly laughed, but the sticky sweetness on my fork reminded me this was real. I scanned the names again, adding Eleanor, Felix, and Juniper to her chart. She recorded each swiftly, murmuring that having backups was just smart planning. I wondered if she'd already bought nursery paint swatches and crib catalogs. The sunlight had shifted, spotlighting her clipboard like a prophecy. I paused between bites and thought about steering the conversation toward hobbies or travel dreams, safer territory. But every time I tried, Samantha veered back to name meanings. How Clara meant bright, Milo meant soldier, and why those vibes mattered. I felt a pull between being curious about her passion and wanting to hide behind a more typical date script. Still, I admired her drive. Some people spent years in limbo. She had staked her ground from minute one. When the final chocolate croissant appeared, I knew this would be my last chance to wrap up the name marathon. I complimented her organization skills and suggested she should write a book on naming tips, a playful idea to pivot. Samantha smiled genuinely at that and said she'd thought about it. She asked if I consider co-authoring a chapter on modern naming trends. I laughed, thinking about the chapter title, How to Survive a First Date Name Audit. She laughed too, tucking a loose hair behind her ear. As the cafe lights shifted and the lunch crowd thinned, Samantha closed her clipboard with a decisive snap. She slid it into her tote, dusted off her jeans, and said she'd loved hearing my picks. I gathered my things, the platter of crumbs and empty mugs reminding me how hungry I'd been at the start. We stood, exchanged that classic, nice seeing you, lean in, and she said she'd be in touch, hopefully for more than just baby and brainstorming. Walking away, I felt a mix of relief and exhilaration. I'd survived the most unconventional first date scenario I could imagine. My phone buzzed with a notification from her. Just finalize our list. We'll send you a PDF. I stared at the screen, wondering if she was joking or dead serious. Then I smiled, thinking about how memorable this brunch had been and how I might actually keep that PDF. After all, Clara, Milo, and Nora deserved a moment of fame, even if our story never included children. Rolling up to that new rooftop juice bar, I thought I was in for a breezy evening. Fresh pressed green juice, crunchy kale chips, maybe even a sunset view of the skyline. The place was buzzing with young professionals swapping stories over fruit bowls, and I spotted Kinnan leaning against the outdoor ledge, phone in hand. He waved me over like we'd been best friends forever, and I walked right up, sliding onto the bar stool beside him. Right away, he launched into how he'd started this mindfulness lighting experiment, where he assessed people's energy by the way shadows played on their faces. I nodded along, thinking it was just another quirky hobby. Then he leaned in, squinted at me under the string lights, and said, "I bet you're about 140 pounds. My stomach flipped. I managed to laugh and said, "That's not how this works." He tapped his chin and adjusted to candlelight, paused dramatically, and guessed again. 142. No, 138. Next thing I knew, he was shifting me from the bright lantern glow to the soft amber bulbs by the bar, inspecting my profile like he was reading tea leaves. I backed up a bit, lifted my chin, and joked, "Are you recruiting me for your next yoga retreat or what?" Instead of dropping it, he explained how our weight in different light told him about our inner balance and chakra alignment. I sipped my coconut water mocktail, wondering if anyone else had slipped away to the restroom. A group at the next table shot me sympathetic looks. One friend gave me the run now nod, but I stayed put. Figuring I had to play along, I asked him to demo. He grabbed my hand, held it up to a neon strip above the bar, and whispered that the 90-degree angle of light revealed my true number. Before I could protest, he blurted 136.7. I shook my head, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks as people glanced over. Trying to reset, I said, "So, how did you land on this lighting routine?" He told me about a guru he saw on an obscure podcast, someone claiming that shadows help you face your light and dark sides. At that point, I figured I'd get more authentic conversation if I strayed into safer territory, so I asked about his day job. He launched into a spiel about fintech startups and risk management until I drifted back to the lighting business. By the time our bowls of dragon fruit smoothie and chaya pudding arrived, I was on full alert. He balanced his iPhone flashlight under my chin, rotating me slowly, and announced my third estimate, 139.2. I almost spat out my smoothie. I laughed and said, "You know what? I give up. You win." His grin spread like he'd just solved a cosmic puzzle. Picking at chia seeds, I dug for a topic that might derail the weight guessing. I asked about his weekend plans. He sighed and said he was booked for another mindfulness workshop, this time on emotional thermography, where they'd measure feelings by forehead heat patterns. I tried to imagine that and almost choked on a granola cluster. Deciding to lean in, I said, "Okay, Mr. Mindful, tell me something real about you, not your shadow games." He stared at me for a beat, like I had spoken a secret password, then told me about his childhood move across the country and how he felt invisible until he started studying body language. I nodded, feeling him open up for once beyond the light tests. Surprisingly, the vibe shifted. He asked me where I grew up, and I launched into a story about summers in my grandma's garden, the lavender fields, the raspberry pies, the time I tried to grow carrots and ended up with funny little knobs instead of roots. He listened, eyes warm, and I realized I hadn't thought about grandma's garden in years. A breeze kicked up, and suddenly the light swayed, casting new patterns across the rooftop. Ken straightened and said, "Last one, I promise." He measured my silhouette against the moonlight, paused, and finally said, 140 exactly. I laughed, feeling some of the tension drain away. "You know," I said, "you should try guessing people's favorite memories next time." He chewed on that, then nodded. "I could," he admitted, "but this lighting thing is oddly addictive." I suggested we do a memory exercise instead and told him about the time I learned to ride a bike at age 9, scraped knees and all. He smiled, and I caught a glimpse of the guy behind the mind games, someone who just wanted to connect. When the staff started dimming lights for a last call, Ken closed his notebook of lighting notes and tucked it into his jacket. He turned to me and said, "Thanks for playing along, even when I was a weirdo." I shrugged, brushed back my hair, and said, "Your weirdness was memorable." Walking down the steps, the night air felt soft against my skin. Ken held the door open for me, nodded at the skyline, and asked if I wanted to continue this mindfulness practice over coffee sometime. I grinned and said yes, under normal lighting conditions only. Later, as I got home, I found myself replaying the night's antics. The guesses under neon, the iPhone flashlight under my chin, the shift to moonlight revelations. Weird as it was, I realized I'd learned something about myself and about trusting first impressions, even if they came wrapped in shadow tests. And for once, I didn't mind being measured by the light. I stepped into that dimly lit tapas bar expecting nothing more than small plates, a glass of sangria, and some easy chatter. The wood-paneled walls were covered in old black and white photos, and lanterns cast a warm glow on the communal tables. I spotted Harry at the far end, tucked between two friends chatting about office drama. He caught my eye, gave a quick wave, and I made my way over, buzzing with the usual first date jitters. Right after I sat down, he ordered a round of wine for the table and told me not to worry. He had the tab covered. I relaxed a bit, thinking he was just being generous. As our appetizers arrived, patatas bravas, garlic shrimp, manchego, stuffed piquillo peppers, I complimented his choice. He smiled and said he thought it was a perfect vibe for getting to know someone. We clinked glasses and dove in the spicy sauces and crispy potatoes, making it impossible not to smile. When the server brought the main courses, seafood pella for him, a mushroom risotto for me, Harry leaned in and said casually, "By the way, I have a rule." I laughed nervously, thinking it was a playful setup for some humorous anecdote. Instead, he looked me dead in the eye and said, "If tonight's bill goes over $60, you legally agree to a second date or pay me back." My fork paused halfway to my mouth. I blinked at him, certain I had misheard. He shrugged, fork still in hand, and explained calmly that he had too many flaky dates. Women would let a night go way past casual price points, use his generosity as a free pass, and then ghost him. So he drew up a simple agreement. If the cost exceeded $60, the woman either committed to round two or returned the extra. He slid a crisp sheet of paper across the table, a mini contract complete with a date, our names, a witness line, and a signature block. My head spun. I set down my fork, drained the rest of my wine, and said, "You can't be serious." He tapped the paper with his fingertip and said, "Dead serious. It's either a commitment or a reimbursement." I stared at the bill estimate at the bottom, $75. My mind raced through possibilities. Scribble a signature for a second date or whip out my card and cover the $15 overage. It felt like a bizarre high-stakes test halfway through Pella. "Let's talk this out," I said, leaning closer. "Why put this on a contract?" He sighed, explaining that being ghosted after an expensive meal hurt more than a broken heart. He wanted to avoid the emotional pinch and the dent in his wallet in one fell swoop. As he spoke about past disasters, like the time a date canceled mid-dessert, his tone was more rueful than smug. I found myself feeling sympathetic even as I fumed at the audacity. I asked if I could just send a text later to schedule a follow-up instead of signing on the spot. He shook his head. "Online agreements are too easy to ignore," he said. "Paper's more binding." I pointed out that it sounded like dating had turned into a vendor contract. He grinned and said, "Maybe it's just modern romance." At that moment, the waitress delivered our desserts, flan and churros dusted in cinnamon sugar, and the air filled with sweet steam. Between bites of cream and sugar, I weighed my options. The flan was silky and comforting, exactly what I needed to think straight. I remembered how I hated feeling cornered, yet I didn't want to offend him. The more I chewed, the more I realized I had to call his bluff. I asked him if he ever let it slide for someone who really clicked. He smirked and said exceptions were for unicorns. Rare, magical, shouldn't be counted on. "Fine," I said, wiping caramel off my lip. "Let's renegotiate." He raised an eyebrow. "Okay," I continued. "How about I cover the overage if we agree right now on the second date? But if we decided to hard no, you waive the extra fee." He cocked his head and said, "That sounds fair." I grabbed a pen from my bag. I always carried one, weirdly, and scrawled my initials next to his. He sighed in relief and signed beneath me, officially sealing the deal. We laughed at the absurdity of our little legal wrangling, and suddenly the mood lightened. He toasted me with a churro stick dipped in chocolate and confessed he'd been bracing for me to walk out. I admitted I'd almost done a dramatic exit myself. For a moment, neither of us said anything, just stared at the empty plates and the mini contract lying between us, like a relic of a peculiar battle. Once the check arrived, I slipped my card into the folder and let him pick it up. He looked at the receipt, saw the final tally, and said, "Looks like you win this round." I grinned and replied, "Only because I signed your terms." We got up, paid, and walked into the evening breeze, our laughter mixing with the canyon's night air. I asked if he planned to bring the contract to every date. He shook his head and said no, only special ones. Over the next block, we planned our second date. No contracts this time, over tacos at a food truck he swore had street cred. We agreed on time and place, both of us smiling at how something awkward turned surprisingly fun. As I hailed an Uber, he slipped his arm through mine and said thanks for being a good sport. I replied that it was the most memorable first date I'd ever had. Back at home, I found myself staring at that little contract on my desk, folding and unfolding it like a fortune from a cookie. I couldn't decide if I loved the creativity or hated the rigidity, but it felt like we cleared the weirdness hurdle early. I sank his contact under hairy contract guy and drifted off to sleep thinking about churros, pella, and how unconventional rules might just make an ordinary date unforgettable. That Friday night, I figured I'd be grabbing draft beer and greasy burgers at the new pub down the street. Nothing fancy, just a break from my small apartment and my ever-growing laundry pile. When I showed up, though, I spotted Natalie sprawled on a bar stool in a vintage band tee and skinny jeans, sipping on a bourbon neat like she'd been there all day. The place buzzed with pool balls clicking and laughter, and she waved me over with that "I've got a story" grin I'd almost forgotten about. Barely had I perched on the stool when she launched in without skipping a beat. "So I once dated a married man for a whole year," she said, sounding tired and proud all at once. I nearly choked on my beer. It felt like someone dropping a grenade in a crowded room. I stared at her, half expecting her to laugh and say she was kidding. But her eyes were dead serious, like she'd just cracked open something she'd been carrying around forever. I wiped foam from my lip and said, "Wait, what?" She leaned forward, elbows on the bar, and told me about this guy named Mark she met at a conference. He was charming, sharp suit, quick wit, the kind of guy who made you feel like you were the only person in the room. They hit it off immediately, and she said she knew pretty early on that he was married. Instead of running away, she decided to stick it out. It was electric, she told me. Like riding a wave you know will crash, but you can't resist. My heart was racing as I leaned closer. I asked how she kept it a secret from his wife, and Natalie laughed, a short, knowing laugh that sounded almost guilty. She said she befriended the wife, Linda, first. It was genius in its simplicity. She met Linda at a book club, bonded over reprints of vintage pulp novels, even hosted a dinner party at her place. Meanwhile, she was sneaking off for lunch meetings with Mark during office hours, adopting every excuse under the sun. I asked if she ever felt awful about it. She sipped her bourbon and said sometimes. But honesty isn't always the best policy, she shrugged. At least, not if you want to keep the story alive. I stared down at my beer, swirling it like it had the answers. I wondered how many times the two women hugged, oblivious to the web Natalie was weaving. She described how she and Linda became close. Shopping trips, running buddies, even weekend brunch circles. She said it was the greatest con she ever pulled. Every new detail felt like stepping deeper into a haunted house. She told me about the day Linda gushed about her husband's surprise anniversary gift, how it killed her to smile and congratulate her. But she stayed, played the part. She'd be at Linda's house painting the spare bedroom one afternoon, then slip up to meet Mark across town for dinner when the mailman delivered bills. I couldn't believe how calm she sounded, as if leading two separate lives was just another Tuesday. I let my jaw drop and asked how it ended. Natalie said Mark finally pulled the plug when his wife got suspicious of his late-night emails. He called Natalie, panicked, saying he'd risk everything to be with her if she wanted, but the guilt had caught up. She chalked his flip-flop up to cowardice. He was married for a reason, she said, looking me straight in the eye. I was the fun part. She was stability. The words cut me sharper than any knife. Around us, the bar's jukebox switched to a melancholy blues tune, and I felt like the only sober person in a bar full of ghosts. I asked if she ever told Linda the truth. She shook her head. "Why spoil a perfect friendship?" she said. "We still hang out. Now I'm just dating Mr. Single." She laughed and slid me a sideways glance like this was all some wild badge of honor. I glanced at her, halfway between admiration and sheer disbelief. I asked if she felt lonely carrying that secret. She paused, staring into her glass as though the ice cubes contained all the right answers. Finally, she said, "Lonely? Sometimes, but secrets are like glitter. You can't sweep them away completely." She traced a circle on the bar with her finger, smudging a water ring around her glass. I shook my head, wondering how she slept at night. She said she'd become so numb to it that it felt normal. She told me she kept a journal, not about feelings, but about logistics. Dates, times, excuses. It was a spreadsheet of guilt. I asked if she ever tried to break free, go clean. She set down her glass and looked me straight in the eye. "Clean isn't a word I know anymore," she confessed. "I thrive in the gray." The bartender called out an order for a couple of craft IPAs, and she waved him off. She reached across and gave my hand a squeeze. "Don't judge me too hard," she said softly. "I'm complicated." I squeezed back, thinking that complicated sounded like code for broken. I asked what she learned from it all. She shrugged, smiling the way someone does when they don't want to admit how badly they messed up. "That love stories are overrated," she said. Our beers arrived, and I lifted mine in a toast. "You're the greatest con you ever pulled," I said. She clinked hers against mine and took a slow swallow. Then she asked if I believed in redemption. I chewed on that before replying. "I want to," I said. She nodded, looking like she almost believed it too. We sat there as the bar emptied, the last few patrons stumbling out into the night. Nayli leaned back, finishing her bourbon. I realized I felt tired, mentally hungover from the story she just dropped on me. Yet I also felt this weird respect for her honesty in the telling. She wasn't apologizing, just owning it. When she'd finally stood to go, she hooked her purse strap over her shoulder and shrugged like she was heading home from a normal evening. I walked her to the door and asked if she'd ever tell Linda the truth. She paused in the doorway, cold night air brushing her hair. "Maybe someday," she said. Then she turned and disappeared into the city lights without looking back. I walked home wondering if I'd ever be able to unhear that story, if I'd ever look at friendship or marriage the same way again. The night had started as simple beers and ended as a lesson in moral complexity. And as I unlocked my door, I realized that secrets have a way of following you home, no matter how far you run. So when Ben suggested we meet at that cozy little bistro with fairy lights and mismatched chairs, I jumped at the chance for a low-key Friday night. The smell of garlic and rosemary hit me the second I walked in, and I spotted him in the corner scrolling on his phone. He looked up, flashed a half smile, and waved me over like we'd been pals forever. I slid into the seat across from him, already craving a glass of something red. No sooner had I settled in than Ben launched into his sob story. He told me in vivid detail how his childhood dog ran away when he was 8 and how his dad never believed him when he said he saw the dog cross the street. I nodded along, sipping my Pinot Noir, trying to muster sympathy. He described that awful afternoon of searching the neighborhood, the guilt he felt, and the guilt his parents heaped on him. By the time the breadbasket arrived, I felt like I'd been handed someone else's breakup tears. He watched me closely, waiting for my reaction. "Tough, huh?" he said, voice soft. I swallowed a piece of baguette and offered a sympathetic nod. He leaned back, folding his arms as if grading my response. I realized I was part of some informal experiment. He wanted to see if I'd cry, look uncomfortable, or just move on. I asked about the dog's name, Max, and he told me Max never came back, but he carried that loss into adulthood. Between bites of creamy mushroom risotto, I wondered if I should steer the conversation elsewhere. I tried asking about his week, work, hobbies, anything. He deflected with another anecdote, a college roommate who moved out in the middle of the semester, leaving him with the rent and a broken stereo. He described the eviction notice that followed and nights spent on a lumpy Futon Inn empty apartment. He spoke with a practiced tone, like he delivered his monologue 100 times. Our entrees arrived, a perfectly seared salmon for me and steak frites for him, and he paused to let me taste my food. He told me he was curious how someone I knew would react to his tale of financial ruin. I said it sounded rough, and he nodded approvingly. I took a bite of salmon, the lemon zest bright on my tongue, and asked if he ever recovered from that lease fiasco. He shrugged and said he'd just moved on. paying off his debt slowly, learning to trust people less. As the waiter cleared our plates, Ben's eyes lit up. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small notebook. He flipped it open to a page titled Tears Tracking. Underneath were women's initials and checkboxes, some marked empathic, others stoic, a few with little happy face stickers. My heart pounded. He asked if I'd mind being included, that he was collecting data on emotional availability. I laughed, uneasy and half in disbelief, then realized he was serious. I put down my napkin and told him I thought emotional honesty was more of a spectrum than a checkbox. He nodded, as if accepting a critique, then asked why I hadn't offered water to the waitress when she refilled his glass. I blinked. "Did you need water?" I asked. He said he'd been dehydrated that day and noted I didn't notice. I told him I saw him look thirsty but was focused on our conversation. He scribbled something, attention focus, somewhere else. I felt uneasy, like I was auditioning for a role I never signed up for. I tried to salvage the evening by talking about my own life, funny roommate stories, my weekend road trip plans. He listened, but every time I laughed or grimaced, he seemed to scan my expression, jotting notes. "Interesting reaction," he murmured when I tripped over a joke about my cat. I wanted to smack that notebook out of his hand. Instead, I asked if he ever used this method with guys. He grinned and said men were harder to read, too proud to show any cracks. Women give better data, he admitted. My eyebrows shot up. "That's kind of messed up," I said. He shrugged like it was obvious. "I'm not emotionally available," he said bluntly. "But I enjoy seeing how others process emotions. It's entertaining." I set my fork down and studied him. He looked so casual, as if analyzing sob stories were a harmless hobby. I asked what he did with all this data. He closed the notebook and slid it across the table. "I write about it," he said. "My blog on emotional patterns has a small following." I felt queasy. He'd been collecting our tears and reactions to post online. I asked if any of the women knew. He said they consented after the fact. My phone buzzed with a text from my roommate. "You okay?" I looked at Ben, trying to decide if I should cut and run, but I also felt this weird pity for him, someone who couldn't connect but craved the illusion of understanding others. He poured me another glass of wine and said, "Tell me about your last heartbreak." I shook my head and said I didn't feel like rehearsing pain for someone's study. That seemed to disappoint him, like I'd broken a rule. He checked his watch and asked if I'd stay for dessert. I hesitated, then agreed, partly because I'd already dropped $40 on risotto and partly out of a stubborn refusal to bail. We ordered creme brulee and ended up talking about lighter things. Favorite movies, why pineapple on pizza wasn't that bad, the art of doing nothing. For a few minutes, I almost forgot his cold experiment. When the sugar-crusted custard arrived, he handed me the spoon and said, "Go ahead, break it." I tapped the top until it cracked satisfyingly, then tasted the vanilla cream underneath. He smiled in that way that suggested approval. I realized that while he'd come with a notebook full of schemes, he'd also surprised me with genuine curiosity once I'd refused to play his games. The bar's light started to dim as they prepared to close. Ben slid the notebook back into his pocket and tipped his chair back. "You're different," he said. "You didn't just react, you engaged." I raised an eyebrow, wondering if that was intended as a compliment. He shrugged, standing up and offering me his hand. We walked outside into the cool night air, the city lights humming around us. I told him I had fun despite the data collection, and he laughed, saying he was trying a new approach to dating. I admitted it was one of the strangest first dates I'd ever experienced, but also one of the most revealing. He nodded, looked at me seriously, and said, maybe I'll stop chasing reactions and start letting people just be. I smiled, thinking he might actually learn something beyond his notebook. We said goodnight under a street lamp, and I walked away feeling oddly energized. Sure, he treated my emotions like a study, but I'd shown up, set boundaries, and still shared a laugh. As I made my way home, I decided that emotional availability was the ultimate power move, and I'd just proven I had it in spades. I've been looking forward to trying that new ramen spot all week, so when Lily texted me there, I thought it'd be a chill Thursday night. Bubbling broth, chewy noodles, maybe a shared order of gyoza. The place was buzzing when I walked in, steam drifting from every table, and I spotted her at a corner booth scrolling on her phone. She looked up, grinned, and waved me over like we'd been planning this for days. I slid into the seat across from her, took a deep breath of garlic-scented air, and felt a weird flutter of excitement. Just as I was about to compliment her jacket, her phone buzzed and she shot me a look that mixed apology and mischief. "Heads up," she said, tapping her screen. "You're about to meet someone special." Before I could ask who, she swiped to FaceTime and held it out. The screen lit up with her dad's stern face, all white hair and sharp eyebrows, sitting in what looked like a study line with books. I felt my heart skip. I hadn't prepared for this. "Hey, Dad," Libby said, her voice casual like this was totally normal. I managed a weak wave. Her dad leaned forward, studying me. "You're the one Lily brought," he said, voice gravelly. "Let's see how you sit." I glanced at my posture, slumped slightly, and straightened up. He nodded, then said, "Back straight, shoulders down." "Good." Around us, the waitstaff passed bowls of ramen and trays of pickles. I took a sip of my water, trying to focus on the spicy pork broth in front of me instead of the man judging every line of my back through a tiny screen. Lily's eyes danced with excitement. "Dad, tell him what I told you. Rate his posture." Her dad cleared his throat. 7 out of 10, he announced. I blinked. "Could improve if you relax your neck." I tilted my head back so badly I nearly fell off the bench. Lily laughed and mouthed sorry before her dad barked advice about chin position. Once the posture audit was over, Lily set her phone down and we dug into our ramen. I slurped a mouthful of noodles and asked her how this became dinner protocol. She shrugged between bites of seaweed salad. "He's got standards," she said. "If I bring someone home, I want to know if he's solid." I chewed thoughtfully, the heap of chili oil coursing through me. Solid. That was definitely the word she used. Halfway through the broth, her phone buzzed again. She glanced at it, leaned across, and said, "Dad's joining again." The screen flipped to a group FaceTime. Her mom appeared beside him, arms crossed, and a family friend popped up in the corner. My stomach turned over. This was turning into a panel interview, not a date. "Show your manners," her mom said, voice softer but just as intense. I put down my chopsticks and said, "Nice to meet you, ma'am." She nodded, satisfied. The friend piped up next. "Can you tell us your intentions with our Lily?" I swallowed a dumpling whole. "I'd like to get to know her better," I said, voice steady. "I think she's funny, smart, and I really enjoy her company." Her dad made us sound like a chainsaw starting. "Explain what makes her smart," he demanded. I blurted out something about her photography skills and her weirdly perfect trivia knowledge. He said that would do. Lily told them to let me eat, so her mom signed off. Then the friend waved goodbye. Her dad lingered, though. He asked about my job, my parents, my rent situation. I answered carefully, the ramen cooling in front of me. He scribbled notes on a pad I couldn't see. Every so often he'd say, "Good answer," or rephrase that. It felt surreal, like I was being coached Mindy. When the waitress came by with mochi ice cream, Lily's dad leaned in one last time. "Final question," he said. "Rate your confidence today on a scale of 1 to 10. I blinked. Confidence. I checked my reflection in the window, messy hair, rim and broth on my lip. I shrugged and said, "Maybe a 6. He pursed his lips. "7, Lily interjected. He nodded reluctantly, then gave me a quick thumbs up. "You passed," he said, and ended the call. We watched the screen go dark, then I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. Lily reached over, nudged my arm, and said, "Sorry about the pop quiz." I waved it off. Actually, that was memorable. She laughed and dug into her mochi. I tried mine, green tea flavor, icy sweet, and asked what grade I'd get in loyalty if I agreed to a second date. She smirked. "A plus," she said. We stayed a while longer, talking about normal stuff. Movies, music, why her dad had a weird fascination with spinal alignment. She told me he'd been a PE coach and still couldn't retire the role of judge. I asked if I would have to FaceTime him every time. She said only when her mom was bored. I laughed, thinking she was half joking. By the time we left, the sidewalk lights were twinkling and the night air felt electric. Lily slipped her hand into mine and said, "Walk me home." That sounded way better than any parental evaluation. We strolled down quiet streets, talking about nothing important. Every so often she'd tap my back, testing my posture, and I'd straighten up, winking at her. When she reached her door, she turned to me and said thanks for surviving dinner with her entire family. I smiled and said it was the best crash course in etiquette I'd ever had. She hugged me quickly and whispered, "See you Friday. No FaceTime." I grinned, nodded, and waved goodbye. Walking back to my place, I realized I'd never experienced a first date quite like that, and somehow I couldn't wait for the next one. I'd barely taken off my coat when Kevin greeted me in the lobby of that artsy coffee shop, holding two almond lats like he'd been waiting all day. The place smelled like freshly ground beans and sweet pastries, and I spotted exposed brick walls lined with local gallery prints. He flashed me a grin and said, "Ready for a quick tour?" I nodded, thinking we'd grab our drinks and settle at a corner table. Instead, he steered me straight toward the exit. Outside, the twilight air felt crisp. Kevin pulled out his phone and tapped the map app. "I only date women from neighborhoods where people are, agreeable," he said, holding the phone so I could see colored zones. "These areas here," he pointed to mint green sections, "are where I've found the kindest personalities. The yellow ones, not so much." My lot sloshed as I tried to follow his finger. Was this part of the date or some casual field trip? We walked down the block, his eyes glued to the screen. I teased that I'd grown up 2 blocks over from a toxic green zone and hoped that didn't disqualify me. Kevin chuckled and said I was safe for now. He launched into his research process, random surveys at dog parks, coffee shop interactions, even overheard elevator conversations. According to his data, neighborhood vibes boiled down to a personality index he perfected over months of living room spreadsheets. I asked how this got started. He laughed, recalling a disastrous first date with someone who grew up in a red zone, and talked nonstop about conspiracy theories. He promised himself never again. Now every date was pre-screened by his custom map. He said he'd been burned too many times by unfiltered negativity. I took a sip of lot, the almond flavor sharp on my tongue, and wondered if I should mention I once spilled wine on my ex's roommate. We strolled past a row of townhouses, the windows glowing with warm yellow light. Kevin nodded approvingly and said this block ranked highly for empathy and small talk charm. He then did a quick pivot toward a more rundown street, scowling at the cracked pavement. "Definitely avoid these blocks," he said. "They skew too high in cynicism." I tried to picture what a cynical neighborhood looked like. Did the mailman sneer? Were stray cats disdainful? As we rounded a corner park, he spotted a dog walker chatting with a passerby and steered us closer. He struck up a conversation about the dog's breed and watched the woman's reaction, nods, and laughter. After a few minutes, he whispered, "Check, this person's agreeable." I rolled my eyes but clapped for the dog. He beamed like he'd won the lottery. By then, my latte was nearly gone, and my arms ached from holding it while wandering around town like a lost tourist. I said maybe we could sit inside now and talk about something besides map coordinates. He hesitated like he wrestled with his own rules, then led me back to the coffee shop entrance. We claimed a table by the window, and I finally got to rest my arms. Kevin pulled out a laminated printout. It looked like a heat map of the city, color-coded by friendliness scores. He slid it across the table and said he wanted to hear my thoughts on his methodology. I squinted at tiny dots and lines and asked if he ever considered people change neighborhoods or online friends these days. He nodded and said online behavior wouldn't count. He preferred face-to-face interactions. I pointed out that excluded 21st century dating. He frowned but conceded it was a fair point. A barista arrived with our second round, hot chocolates this time, and Kevin poked at the map again. I asked him what happened if someone from a lower scoring area surprised him with kindness. He said he probably overlooked their zip code after a genuine connection. I pressed him to explain what counted as genuine, and he admitted he looked for sustained positivity. So, if someone from a red zone cracked a joke at the right moment, he even might bend his own rules. His map wasn't law, it was guideline. I leaned back and asked about his own neighborhood rating. He grinned and said he lived in a solid green zone where neighbors borrowed sugar and greeted each other on morning walks. He described an annual block party he co-hosted, free lemonade, and potluck pies. I perked up at this picture of community. He told me the best part was how you could spot bad apples quickly. If someone didn't join the conga line, you knew. I laughed at that mental image. As we sipped our hot chocolates, the conversation drifted away from maps. I told him about my childhood block where every front porch welcomed you, even the cranky old neighbor whose tomatoes were dangerous. He listened, genuinely intrigued, and I realized the map was just an icebreaker. Underneath, he was someone craving predictable warmth in a chaotic dating world. He asked if I ever judged people by where they lived. I admitted I once avoided a crowded street because it seemed too flashy. He laughed and said everyone had biases. And he said maybe he should add bias awareness as a variable on his map. I joked that he'd need a separate layer of data just for my quirks. He smiled like he had something filtered for that. Outside, the streetlights flickered on. Our coffees vanished, and neither of us reached for the bill. Kevin admitted he'd learned more about neighborhoods than about people on this adventure. He said maybe he should start arrows at the coffee shop and see who genuinely welcomed him inside, no matter their zip code. I liked how he framed that, a shift from territorial profiling to invitation spotting. By the time we left, Kevin had folded up his map, tucking it into his jacket pocket. He offered me a hand, and we strolled under strings of fairy lights hanging between buildings. He asked if I wanted to try one more neighborhood walk, just a casual detour to see if my block made the cut. I laughed, said sure, and we headed down a quieter street line with row houses. That block was quiet, lights off in most windows. Kevin frowned and said the data suggested low nighttime neighbor chit-chat. Then from inside one house, lights flicked on and music drifted, someone hosting a living room jam session. We paused, listened to laughter and guitar chords, and Kevin said, "See, you can't map spontaneity." I watched him smile, notebook free, and felt the warmth of real surprise. We wrapped up there and finally parted ways at the corner where my street met his. I teased him about scrapping the map altogether. He laughed and said he'd hang on to it, forge you habits and jokes. Then he looked me in the eye and said neighborhood didn't matter when someone made you feel at home. I felt lighter than I had at the coffee shop earlier. Walking toward my door, I realized I'd spent an hour being led by a moving map of personality, but ended up guided by a genuine curiosity. And for once, I didn't care if my block was coded green or red. I just wanted to see where that curiosity would take us next. The place was packed, neon signs flickering off glass railings, and I spotted a Mary waiting by a high-top table, sipping something pink and bubbly. He waved me over with a grin that said he'd been counting the minutes. I pushed through the crowd, ordered a ginger ale from the bar, and slid onto the stool across from him. He greeted me with a quick hey, then dove right in. "So tell me," he said, leaning back in his chair, "how much do you have in savings?" My eyebrows shot up. Before I could take a sip, he followed up, "I need to know how hard I can hit you in court if it ever comes to that." The words hit me like a bucket of cold water. City lights blurred as I blinked, staring at my drink. Was this a joke? He looked totally serious. I set my ginger ale down and laughed nervously. "You're not messing with me?" I asked. He shook his head, tracing the rim of his glass with one finger. "I'm all about transparency," he said. "If this goes south, I need a clear idea of our financial standing." I felt heat rising in my cheeks. Who starts a date by sizing of how to sue you? My mind raced through responses, angry, amused, or run. I settled on curiosity. "Let's say I'm not thrilled by the question," I said. He shrugged like it was normal. "Fair," he said. "But I've been hurt before. I don't want a financial surprise." He told me about his last relationship, how a messy breakup left him with half the rent and none of the shared savings. He insisted no more free rides, no more disappearing acts. I nodded slowly, sipping my ginger ale to buy time. Around us, the bar's chatter swelled, couples laughing, friends toasting, waiters juggling trays. Trying to shift gears, I asked about his favorite cocktails. He named a handful, mezcal old-fashioned and grapefruit palomas, then circled back to my savings. I raised my hand like a student in detention. "Can we talk about something else?" He sighed and said okay, but warned me I'd need to send over bank statements by the end of the night if I wanted a second date. My jaw dropped. He actually had a pen and napkin ready to jot down account numbers. Our drinks arrived, my ginger ale replaced by a sparkling lemon spritz, and I focused on the bubbles dancing in the glass. The first few sips were refreshing after the financial ambush, but I couldn't shake the awkward tension. He asked if I had student loans, car payments, a mortgage. I laughed and admitted I was fresh out of college, living modestly in a studio. He nodded, wrote down modest renter like it was a resin bullet point. Suddenly, I remembered the tiny tray of truffle fries I'd spotted on the menu. I suggested we order an appetizer and see how he reacted. He agreed, so we ordered fries with aioli and a side of jalapeno poppers. While we waited, I felt the date slipping into some weird blend of job interview and courtroom cross-examination. He flipped through his phone, pulling up a widget that tracked his net worth. I resisted the urge to duck and cover. When the fries landed, I tried to lighten the mood. I scooped one and offered it to him. He took it, bit into the crispy potato, and said, "These are good," like a teenager discovering pizza rolls for the first time. I laughed and said maybe food was our common ground. He smiled, said he appreciated carbs with a crunchy coating, then immediately asked who paid for my last cell phone upgrade. I slowed my chewing, fought the urge to spit out the fry. I decided to strike a balance between humor and honesty. I told him I thought money conversations mattered, but maybe not 5 minutes in. He mulled that over and admitted he sometimes overshoots with these tests. He said he'd tone it down, just a bit. I thanked him, and we moved on to safer territory, favorite travel spots. He brightened talking about Costa Rica, waterfalls, and zip lines. I relaxed a notch. As we dove into stories of bad hostel roommates and surprise storms in Bali, the jalapeno poppers arrived. He grabbed one, wiped his fingers on a napkin, then asked if I ever traveled solo or if I always needed a plan. I told him I loved spontaneous trips, packing a bag and hitchhiking to the beach. He raised his eyebrows, impressed that I could find my way without a spreadsheet. He said spontaneity was attractive, even if it sometimes meant financial unpredictability. I grinned and reminded him that ziplining off a waterfall wasn't exactly a budget excursion. He laughed and conceded that risks sometimes have a price tag. Then he leaned forward again. "Just so we're clear," he said, eyes twinkling, "if this goes somewhere, I expect full disclosure on all investments." He cracked a smile, like it was a playful one-liner. I exhaled and said, "Deal after we see if there's a second date in the works." By the time we polished off the fries and poppers, I'd managed to get him to spill his own net worth number. He owned a small stake in his startup, some stock options, a bit in crypto. We compared notes on financial apps and budgeting hacks, and he even gave me a referral link for his favorite investment platform. I realized that while his opening salvo was aggressive, he actually cared about partnership and fairness. When the lights dimmed for last call, we slid our stools back and paid the tab. He handed me a folded napkin with his Venmo username and a little note. "For your savings tracking. Talk soon." I chuckled, tucked the napkin into my jacket pocket, and said I'd Venmo him a coffee next week, provided I still had an emergency fund. He winked and said that was the right approach. Stepping into the cool night air, I felt oddly uplifted. The date had started with a financial ambush, but ended with mutual respect and even a laugh. Mary, scratch that, he introduced himself as Amir, but insisted he rolled the I for style, walked me to the subway station. We talked about meeting again, maybe over brunch where I'd bring my budget spreadsheet and he'd bring his. We said goodnight with a fist bump and a promise to be transparent within reason. On my ride home, I stared at the napkin in my pocket, smiling at the absurdity. He might have been aggressive, but at least he was honest about what mattered to him, trust and fairness, down to the dollar. And as I dozed off to the rumble of the train, I realized that sometimes a little financial transparency, even on the first date, can turn chaos into clarity. So last Friday, I figured I'd hit up that laid-back comedy club downtown. $2 off drafts on open mic night, and a chance to soak up some laughs. The place was smaller than I remembered, all sticky floors and neon signs flickering over mismatched tables. When I walked in, the first thing I noticed was how loud the chatter was. Like half the room was auditioning to outshout the punks trying to record the next big set. I scanned the crowd and saw Ryan tucked into a corner booth, his shoulders hunched over a pale ale, scrolling through his phone. He looked up, caught my eye, and waved me over. I grabbed a pint of their house IPA, bitter, hazy, not my usual, and slid into the seat across from him, thinking we'd catch up over some warm-up packs. Right off the bat, Ryan told me he was going up on stage soon. I nearly snorted my beer. "Tonight?" I asked, and he nodded, brandishing his mitt like it was a steak knife. "Gotta test some new jokes," he said. At first I thought he was joking. He'd mentioned open mic dreams before, but the guy who was on half a minute ago gave him a nod and handed him the mic without hesitation. I watched Ryan hop up, clear his throat, and introduce himself with that cocky grin of his. He led with a quip about his boss's ugly tie, got a few polite chuckles, and spotted me in the front row and paused. "Hey, I see my friend over there," he said, pointing. "You're the one who never laughs." My heart sank like a rock in a pond. Everyone in the crowd had quieted, waiting. I ducked my head, pretending I was checking my phone, and he leaned into it. "Come on, show some love," he called out. I forced a half grin, hoping no one noticed how fake it looked. Ryan took that as permission to launch into a routine that tested every boundary he could find. Gender stereotypes, disability jokes, you name it. Each punchline landed more like a sucker punch, and he paused, eyes on mine, waiting for me to flinch. When I didn't, he cranked it louder. Inside, I felt like I'd been shoved into a lab rat cage. My cheeks burned and my throat went dry, but I stayed planted in the seat because bolting felt too awkward. Finally, he wrapped up with, "If date night's this rough, imagine dating Monday through Friday." The crowd laughed half-heartedly. He took a bow and darted offstage before the MC could kill his mic. A minute later, I found him backstage, wiping sweat off his brow like he'd just run a marathon. "Dude," I hissed before I caught myself. "What the hell was that?" He looked at me like I'd busted him mid-shoplift. "I was testing your reactions," he said, shrugging. "Helps me time my delivery." I wanted to shove his notebook of jokes into the nearest trash can. "This isn't studio feedback," I shot back. "It's a first date." He blinked, genuinely confused, and handed me his scribbled set list, every line annotated with comments. Did she wince? Too edgy. Shift tone. I realized I was a guinea pig in his comedy lab. Back at our table, the MC had called the next act. A guy juggling rubber chickens, so I managed a shaky laugh and ordered another drink. Ryan slid in across from me as if nothing happened. He rubbed the back of his neck and said, "I'm sorry, I thought you'd be into the behind-the-scenes process. I always wanted real-time feedback." I stared at my beer like it held all the answers. "I'm not your creative consultant," I said. "I'm here to hang out." He looked deflated, said he'd tone it down, and for the next half hour we sipped beers and swapped stories like normal people. Favorite albums, that weird guy at the bar with the fedora collection, my ill-fated attempt to learn guitar. After a while, the tension eased. He told me about the first time he tried improv and got booed off stage. And I shared my own horror story of accidentally sending a drunken text meant for my best friend to my boss. We laughed genuinely, and I felt like things might actually click. Then he leaned forward and asked if I'd mind checking out one more set later, just to see how a calmer routine might land. I rolled my eyes but said okay, figuring it was his way of making up for the mess. The next comedian was pretty good, talking about day jobs and awkward Tinder profiles, so we clapped and joked about potentially swiping right on him. In between acts, Ryan scribbled in his notebook again. I asked him to read me one line. He paused, then cleared his throat and said, "What's the deal with airport yoga? Nobody ever told me downward dog could lead to dropped phone." I shrugged. "It's lame," I said. He smiled, relieved, and made a note. "Scrap airports, try cat videos." I shook my head, realizing he really could use an audience beyond our date. By the time the club owner called last call, we shared 2 more drinks, a plate of nachos, and a dozen jokes that never made it past his scribbles. I'd given him honest reactions, laughed when it was funny, frowned when it wasn't, and had survived. Walking outside into the cool night air, the sticky stench of spilled beer still clinging to my clothes, I felt battered but oddly invigorated. Ryan slung his arm around my shoulders and said thanks for being a sport. I told him I'd give him another shot, strictly as friends if he promised no more live testing. He grinned like I'd handed him a second chance at life. Instead of heading home, we ducked into a 24-hour diner down the street, pulling up in a booth under neon lights for coffee and late-night pancakes. No microphones, no note-taking, just 2 people swapping stories until the sun started to peek over the horizon. As I downed a syrupy bite of pancake, I realized that while Ryan needed to find his comedic voice, he also needed to remember there was a real person sitting across from him, not a focus group. And maybe that was the best punchline of all, that sometimes the best material comes when you stop chasing reactions and start sharing genuine moments. I cradled my coffee mug, feeling surprisingly content, and figured next time he asked for feedback, I'd say, "Just be yourself." That, I decided, would be the joke he'd never see coming. The place was cozy, exposed brick walls, vintage light fixtures, low jazz playing softly, and I spotted Brittany already settled in at a corner table, her laptop open like she was waiting on an important deadline. I slid into the seat across from her, tossed my coat over the chair, and paused, ready for a laid-back evening. Barely had I glanced at the menu when Brittany snapped her laptop shut and pushed it toward me. "Here," she said, voice bright. "Open this." I blinked and angled it toward me. A spreadsheet, 6 rows tall, columns labeled income bracket, height range, parents' marital status, sense of humor, and chemistry rating. My mouth went dry. She tapped the empty bottom row. "You fill in your details and we'll see how you compare." I laughed, uneasy, not sure she was joking. She smiled, waved the menus away, and said she wasn't. "I've been tracking my last 5 dates," she explained, "and I need the data to find real matches." I stare at the income column, under 30K, 30K to 60K, 60K to 100K, over 100K. My heart thumped. I cleared my throat and clicked 30K to 60K, half expecting fireworks. Next was height, under 5'8", 5'8" to 6 foot, and lastly over 6 foot. I hovered. I'm 6'1", so I tapped over 6, trying not to blush. Brittany nodded approvingly. Then came parents' marital status. Married, divorced, separated, never married. I typed divorced, then remarried. She scribbled a note and said, "Interesting background, good to know." I felt like a case study. She moved on to sense of humor. Dry, goofy, sarcastic. I chose dry, my favorite self-description. Brittany grinned like she'd unlocked a secret level in a video game. Finally, she left chemistry rating blank, apparently to be filled at the end of the meal. Meanwhile, our waiter hovered, menus in hand, looking like he'd just walked into a physics lab. Suddenly hungry, I changed tactics. "So, tell me about your favorite dishes here," I said. She nodded and leaned back. "First, the roasted Brussels sprouts with pecorino and chili oil," she said. "Then the truffle mushroom risotto." I ordered both, hoping to distract her from the spreadsheet for a while. She smiled and closed her laptop. Not totally, just enough to take a breath. When the Brussels sprouts arrived, they were crisp and tangy, the cheese melting into every crevice. I scooped one up and asked how she'd gotten into this whole data thing. She said she'd always been analytical. Her last job was in market research. After a string of dates that fizzled unpredictably, she decided to apply the same methods to her love life. "I'm tired of surprises," she said, "so I track variables to predict outcomes." I nodded, chewing thoughtfully. "I get wanting to learn from past mistakes," I said. "But is there room for, spontaneity?" She paused mid-smile and said spontaneity was great when it worked, but she learned it rarely did without patterns. She showed me a little bar chart where income and chemistry rating looked correlated, like higher earners tended to report stronger connections. Our risotto arrived, steamy, creamy, dotted with mushrooms and fresh herbs. I dove in and asked about outliers. Did she ever find a low earner who blew all expectations out of the water? She laughed and pointed to one cell. That was a bartender who made me laugh until my sides hurt. She'd given him a chemistry score of 9, despite his income bracket being the lowest. Medical students, she added, also surprised me. I grinned at that. "So you're open to occasional wild cards," I said. She nodded, digging into her risotto. "Definitely," she agreed. "Wild cards keep the experiment exciting." I felt some of the tension ease. She wasn't a robot in love. She was a researcher craving the thrill of exceptions. Halfway through, I asked if she ever worried that dating by spreadsheet could miss the magic. She set down her spoon and said spreadsheets quantify only what you measure. "Feelings slip through columns," she admitted. "But I figure if I track enough, I'll catch the patterns of magic moments too." I thought about my most unexpected connections, friendships, crushes, late-night talks, and wondered how you chart something intangible like laughter that makes your chest ache. I told her about the night I bonded with a stranger over a shared umbrella in a downpour. No warning, no data, all magic. She smiled, eyes soft, and said maybe that was the one data point you cherish outside the pattern. For the first time, I saw the person behind the laptop, someone creating control, but also fascinated by the unpredictable spark. Dessert arrived, a deconstructed cheesecake with berry coulis, and Brittany held out her phone. "Ready for your chemistry rating?" she asked. I pretended to ponder, then said 8. She keyed it in, the cell turning bright green, and cheered. "You're in the top tier," she said. I laughed and felt my cheeks warm. "I'll wear that label with pride," I told her. She slid the laptop in her bag, stood up, and said she'd love to plug my data into her master sheet. I countered, "How about next time we just share a bottle of wine and data-free conversation?" She laughed, nodded, and agreed. Deal. No spreadsheets. We settled the bill together, a quiet team, and stepped into the cool night air. Walking home, I realized I'd spent dinner in a strange mix of lab experiment and genuine connection, and somehow it balanced out. Brittany loved her data, but she also let me in on the outliers that made her smile. And I realized that while patterns can guide you, sometimes it's the unexpected moments you remember. As my phone buzzed with her text, "Great night. 0 spreadsheets promised," I grinned and thought that maybe our next date would be the best data point yet. I was starving, so I ducked into that greasy spoon off Main Street around 9, ready for a late-night burger and maybe some chili fries. The neon sign buzzed open in cracked letters, and inside the place smelled like sizzling bacon and spilled coffee. I slid into a red vinyl stool at the counter, set my jacket on the stool next to me, and glanced over at Dylan, who was already perched 2 seats down, staring at a menu like it held the secrets of the universe. He looked up and flashed that crooked grin he always saves for me. "I don't tip," he said, leaning back so casually I almost choked on my soda. I blinked. "You what?" I asked around a gulp of fizzy water. Dylan shrugged like he was announcing the sky was green instead of blue. "Tipping's a racket," he said. "Servers should flirt for extra cash, not rely on default gratuity." I stared at my menu, half hoping he was joking. But the waitress, red lipstick, hair in a messy bun, glided up to refill my coffee and didn't laugh. Dylan launched into his philosophy right at her. "Hey," he called, louder than he needed to, "you know I don't tip." She froze, coffee pot hovering in her hand, and stared at him like she'd just been asked to juggle knives. I sank lower in my seat and tried to catch her eye, but she gave me a flat smile and said, "Right." Then she went back to pouring coffee for someone else. I lowered my voice. "This is a diner, not a nightclub. Everyone's just trying to do their job." Dylan waved his menu like a triumphant flag. "This is the only honest way. If they want more, they earn it." I ordered a cheeseburger and fries, trying to imagine how many fries might feed someone's dignity. When the waitress returned with my water, I mumbled thanks, feeling guilty for her. Dylan ordered the bacon double cheeseburger and a side of onion rings, then crossed his arms, clearly enjoying the spectacle. A few minutes later, she set a plate of fries in front of me. I picked up a handful and said, "Hey, thanks for these." She nodded without looking up. Dylan leaned forward and said, "You mind showing me some of that famous waitress charm?" I bristled. The waitress paused, eyes rolling so subtly I almost missed it, then plastered on a grin and said it sure. She turned and refilled Dylan's coffee without a hint of enthusiasm. My heart pounded. I chewed a fry and muttered, "You're embarrassing me." Dylan shrugged. "It's fun." I forced myself to focus on the burger when it arrived. Warm bun, melty cheese, crisp lettuce. I took a bite and felt better until Dylan clapped his hands and said, "Next challenge. Get her to giggle." I nearly swallowed my burger whole. "Stop it," I hissed. "This isn't a game." But he wouldn't let go. He called out to her again. "I need the best giggle you got. Come on, earn that tip." She sighed, set a ketchup bottle before him, and flicked it open. Without looking, she must have known what he wanted because she rapped the bottle on the table once, making a light tap noise, then walked away. I stared at the ketchup drips on the table. Dylan howled with laughter. I felt like crawling under the counter. Between bites, I tried to reason with him. "This is your system. You're going to grill every server." He looked proud, like he cracked some code. "Only if they want extra. If they can't flirt, they don't get my cash." I shook my head and said maybe we should split. He frowned and said, "Why bail now? It's my policy." I realized I had 2 options, ride it out or storm off. As I picked at my fries, I noticed the regulars sipping coffee, watching us shoot sideways glances. The waitress was avoiding our end of the counter, eyes fixed on her station. She returned with Dylan's refill, paused, and said softly, "Here you go. No tip." Dylan grinned and said thanks with emphasis. I gulped water and thought about calling a cab. Then a waitress from the back, older woman with a bright apron, strode up. She slid a plate of onion rings in front of Dylan and said, "On the house," like she was sharing a secret. Dylan looked confused. She leaned in and whispered, "You're making my new girl uncomfortable." Then she turned and walked away, heels clicking. The tension snapped. Dylan stared at the battered onion rings and said, "What the hell?" I set my burger down. "Looks like someone earned their tips," I said. He looked around, then back at me. The waitress from the back reappeared with my check, sliding it before me with a kind smile. On top, she'd written, "Thank you for being decent." I felt a lump in my throat, took out cash, and left a 20. Not a token, full respect. Dylan watched, brow furrowed, as I handed the money over. Then I stood and headed for the door. Outside, the cool night air was a relief. I turned to Dylan. "You want to explain yourself?" I asked. He shrugged. Guess I miscalculated the flirting index. I shook my head and said I was done with his honest ways. He said maybe I was in the wrong. I didn't stick around to see if he meant it. As I walked down the sidewalk, neon signs fading behind me, I realized good service wasn't a performance. It was decency, respect, and a genuine smile. No games required. And next time I'm craving a burger, I'll find a place where kindness pays its own tip. When I walked in, I spotted Rads at a high-top table near the back, her purse tucked under one arm and a velvety purple cloth spread out before her like she was hosting a scenes. I raised an eyebrow, zipped past the hostess, and slid in across from her, figuring she'd explain the weird setup. Before I even said hi, Rads tapped the tablecloth and pointed to a crystal ball sitting center stage. Then she turned to two neatly stacked tarot decks and said, "Ready to see your future?" I laughed thinking she was joking, but the look in her eyes told me she was serious. A bartender was eyeing us from behind the bar, ready to take our drink order, but Rads waved him off. Later, she said, "First, we do the reading." I cleared my throat. Sure," I said, trying to sound game. I glanced at the menu stacked under a heavy candle. What should I order? She flipped the velvet cloth so quick I almost missed it, then laid out 3 different card spreads. A Celtic cross, a 3-card past, present, future, and something that looked like a starburst pattern. "Pick one," she instructed. I pointed at the smallest, the 3-card spread. "Let's start simple." She shuffled one of the decks with a grace that made me think she'd been practicing for years. Then she handed the cards to me. "Think of something you want to know," she said. "Don't say it out loud." I thought about whether she'd laugh at me and how jealous my ex would be if they saw this. I picked 3 cards and slid them back. Rads turned them over one by one. The first card was a tower, lightning striking a fortress. She frowned. "That's your past," she said, pointing. "Something crashed down on you." I swallowed, hoping she meant my last laptop. But she leaned forward and said, "I sense betrayal. Your last relationship ended abruptly, and it left you shaken." I glanced at my phone and I laughed. It was silent. I nodded, not ready to confess the full story. The second card was the lovers, 2 figures entwined beneath an angel. Rads' face brightened. "Present moment," she said. "You're seeking connection, maybe deciding between 2 paths." She looked me straight in the eye. "Is it 2 people or 2 choices?" I blinked, feeling a flush. I said I was figuring out work-life balance. She tilted her head and said that was only half the truth. I reached for my sangria glass, finally delivered, and took a big gulp to buy time. The bartender shot me an apologetic look as he set the drink down. Rads moved on to the 3rd card, the moon. "Future," she said. "Uncertainty, illusion, hidden motives." She tapped the crystal ball, saying I'd soon discover something unexpected about someone in my life. I felt my stomach drop. Then she leaned in, voice dropping to a whisper. "Trade time," she said. "One embarrassing secret for one deeper insight." I choked on my wine. "You want," she nodded. "I'll tell you more about your future, but you have to share something you'd rather keep under the lock and key." I sat back, pulse jumping. This was not the vibe I'd signed up for. I glanced at my fish tacos, a late arriving order, and in that moment I knew there was no polite way out. I thought about sharing a tiny secret, something harmless like my middle school name for my diary, but she was watching me expectantly. I took a breath and said, "Fine." When I was 19, I lied to my favorite professor about why I missed class because I was hungover. She paused for dramatic effect, then nodded. "Perfect," she said, jotting notes on the velvet cloth with a gold-tipped pen. "Now I can show you more." She tapped the crystal ball, murmuring something under her breath as the candle flickered. Then she said, "You're going to cross paths with someone new, a person you never see coming, someone tied to your past betrayal. I shifted in my seat. The bartender refilled the sangria. He gave me a sympathetic shrug. Rads reached for the second deck, the one with darker art and gothic imagery. She spread the cards fan style and motioned me to choose again. I hesitated but picked one, about halfway through the deck. She flipped it, the Eight of Cups, a figure walking away from a stack of cups. She smiled. "You're about to leave behind an old pattern," she said. "You'll step into a new phase, one where you trust your instincts more." I wanted to roll my eyes, but something in her tone felt earnest. I looked at the crystal ball as though it might glow. Instead, it sat there like a paperweight. I asked what the pattern was. She said, "You sabotage yourself when you sense risk. Soon you'll choose differently." I shrugged and said maybe I just needed to see it spelled out. She handed me her business card, Rad's Celtic Terra, and told me to come back for a follow-up. By then the tapas plates were empty. I poked at the last shrimp skewer, spotting chili flakes on the rim. I wondered if maybe she'd made up half the reading, but something about how she called my bluff on the secret felt like she really saw me. She packed up her cloth and cards, folding them carefully like someone handling treasured heirlooms. I stood up, put money on the bar, and said thanks. She slipped her tarot bag over her shoulder and grinned. "You'll see," she said softly. "Trust the signs." Then she turned and walked out into the night, just another stranger vanishing into neon lights. I walked home down the quiet streets, my mind buzzing with images of towers and moons. I kept turning her words over. Someone unexpected, stepping away from old patterns. Maybe it was just clever guesswork. Or maybe I really had glimpsed something. Either way, I figured I'd be looking out for new faces and old habits in the weeks to come. And whenever I passed that diner's neon sign, I'd remember. Trading a little secret can buy you a peek at something stranger than fiction. So it all started when I swiped right on Bumble on a sleepy Tuesday night. After 3 disappointing matches in a row, I braced myself for another, "Hey, how's it going?" But then Nicole popped out, bright smile, wind-blown hair, and a little microphone icon in her profile that said podcast host. Intrigued, I messaged her, "A podcast host. What's your show about?" She fired back almost immediately. "It's called Why I'll Never Date You Again. Care to sign a release form before our first date?" I stared at my phone for a solid minute. Part of me thought she was joking. No one really turned dating into audio content, right? But she followed up with her best pitch. "I record every date, then debrief it on air. Helps me learn from my disasters, and hey, it makes dating less weird." I laughed, told her I'd sign just to hear her stories, and we set a date for that Friday evening at a modest bistro on 8th and Pine. When Friday rolled around, I found myself nervously checking my reflection as I entered the bistro. Nicole was already there, in a teal sweater that somehow matched her eyes, earbuds around her neck, laptop open inside a velvet sleeve. She gave me a quick wave and a disarming grin, raising one eyebrow as if to say, "Ready to dive in." I slid into the booth across from her, heart thumping, and tried to keep my cool. She laid the release form on the table like it was a menu. PDF on her phone, ready for my digital signature. Grammy Award interviewers have nothing on her efficiency. I took a breath, tapped through the legal jargon, and signed with a flourish of my fingertip. She pocketed her phone, leaned back, and said, "Nice. Now we can really get into it." Our server came by, Luz, whose name tag read, asked me about the soup specials, and Nicole paused to order sparkling water and the roasted veggie flatbread. I ordered the mac and cheese with bacon and fries, hoping to stick to comfort food while bracing for comfort food-adjacent questions. Between bites of gooey cheese, Nicole asked about my worst dating red flags. I told her about my ex who never complimented me, like never. She nodded, scribbled in her notebook, then asked for a story exchange. I leaned in and recounted the time I accidentally called my boss Mom during a meeting. She laughed so hard she nearly choked on her water, and I felt that first spark of genuine connection. We moved on to happier topics, our mutual obsession with true crime documentaries and weekend hikes in the Arboretum. Nicole put her mic on the table, but when I jokingly ducked behind my bowl, she said, "Nah, let's chat off a record for a bit." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. For 15 minutes, it was just 2 people, not podcaster and guest. Then she set her fork down and said, "Ready for the recorded portion?" I nodded, bracing myself. She tapped her mic and a little beep and said, "Welcome back to Why I'll Never Date You Again. I'm here with," I pretended to clear my throat on cue, and we launched into the formal segment: introductions, why we matched, and what brought us here tonight. She asked me to recount my most embarrassing date, so I told her about the Tinder match who brought his ex's best friend as his wingman. Nicole's genuine sympathy made me feel less ridiculous. Then she turned the tables. Now my turn. She shared how her podcast idea came from a string of ghosting episodes, and one date so bad she still couldn't discuss it without wincing. I listened, realizing how brave she was to air her vulnerabilities on the airwaves. By the time our entrees arrived, mine a second helping of mac and cheese, hers a colorful veggie plate, our podcast recorder had captured about 20 minutes of our conversation. We laughed over subtitles for our future episode, an invited +1 and other red flags. Nicole mouthed, "Too savage." I grinned and said it was honest. After dinner, she saved the recording, unhooked the mic, and said she loved that our chemistry felt real, not forced. I asked if we could do our own debrief. No recording. She said yes, and we spent the next half hour talking about everything from our travel bucket lists to the weirdly long lines at the DMV. It was refreshing. No legal agreements, no microphones, just genuine conversation. When Luz delivered the check, I tipped extra, no flirting required, and we stood up. Nicole shook my hand, then paused and said, "Let's do a bonus episode sometime." I laughed and replied, "Only if you promise to let me host one." She agreed, winking. We walked out into the cool night side by side, and I realized I actually looked forward to our next date, recorded or not. That night, as I walked home under street lamps, I replay our evening. The hush of the bistro, the surprise of the release form, our off-the-record laughs. I knew one thing for sure: if our story ends up on her podcast feed, I'll be the first to subscribe. And even better, I'll have a front row seat to all the never date you again moments we both managed to dodge. I guess sometimes the best dating stories are the ones you get to tell twice.